Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Bridget Nelson. On this episode, Derrell Peel looks at cattle markets. Amit Jhala explains the different characteristics between Palmer Amaranth and Waterhemp. Al Dutcher discusses El Nino weather conditions, and Roger Elmore explains cover crop research that incorporates wheat stubble. Oklahoma State Extension livestock marketing specialist Derrell Peel is our cattle market analyst this week. According to the July USDA Cattle on Feed report, cattle and calves on feed for slaughter market in the U.S. for feedlots with a capacity of 1,000 or more totaled 11.3 million head, which is 4% higher than last year's report and is the highest July 1st inventory since the series began in 1996. For cattle inventory, all cattle and calves in the United States as of July 1st totaled 103 million head, which is 1% above last year's report. In addition, livestock slaughter reports beef production at 2.3 billion pounds. We talked with Derrell Tuesday morning and began by asking for his analysis of this month's Cattle on Feed report.
Well, the July Cattle on Feed report really came in very much as expected. There were no surprises in this. The placements were up about 1% from a year ago, as were the marketings, also up about 1%. And it's important to keep in mind that June had one less business day this year. So if you adjust for that, they were actually, placements and marketings would have been a little bit higher than that on an equivalent month basis. The on-feed total for July 1st is up 4%, really continues what we've seen about the last 3 or 4 months in terms of that year-over-year increase. It's holding pretty steady at about 4%.
So what do you expect for supply and demand levels then?
Well, as we go forward, this report certainly confirms that we still have, more cattle in the pipeline. We've seen that from a supply standpoint. We have a pretty good idea what's going to happen. On the demand side, that's really been the key, not only this year, but really through all of last year. For the last 18 months or so, demand has been, quite strong. Both domestic and international demand has helped support prices and help us move these additional levels of production that we're seeing in the beef industry.
And beef production is about 3.5% above so far this year. How is slaughter and carcass weight going to contribute to beef production within the second half of the year?
Well, we expect to see continued increases year over year in beef production. In fact, on a quarterly basis for the last 2 quarters of the year, probably a little bit stronger than we've seen so far. And again, from the cattle on feed and from the slaughter numbers, we certainly know slaughter numbers will be higher. Carcass weights are also up this year after dropping last year. And one of the keys as we go through the second half of the year will be to watch the seasonal increase that we expect to see in carcass weights, but really how much of a seasonal increase compared to last year. So that may be the only kind of unknown on the supply side right now, is what do these carcass weights do. But the bottom line is, when we get all done on an annual basis, we think that beef production will be up maybe just a tick over 4% on a year-over-year basis.
The cattle report was also released last Friday, and it states that the cattle inventory is up 1% and the calf crop is up 2%. What do these percentages mean, and what can we expect because of this report?
Well, the mid-year cattle inventory report gives us a little bit of a longer-term view of what to expect from the supply side of the industry. So, the all cattle number was up 1%. Beef cows were also up just shy of 1%, about 0.9%. And all of that confirms what we already sort of knew, and that is that there are more cattle here at the mid-year level in the inventory. And that sort of confirms that we're going to see probably minimal growth, or at least some growth, continued growth in the beef cow herd for 2018. One of the other numbers in the report was the beef replacement heifers, which were down 2%. So as we look ahead to 2019, this may suggest that we're about done with expansion. I think we have to kind of wait and see for sure, but it certainly indicates that by January 1, when we get the next annual inventory numbers, that we may be close to seeing a peak in cattle herd. So now the other thing is that, with a bigger cow herd this year, we've got a bigger calf crop. The calf crop estimate, as you noted, was up about 2%. So we got more calves now, but if we can maintain or even increase the cow herd slightly from this point on, that means we'll even have a slightly bigger calf crop in 2019. So it ensures that feeder cattle supplies are going to stay, elevated as we go through 2019 and even on into 2020.
So what do you expect for prices then?
Well, you know, there's supply pressure, which tends to move prices. Second half of the year, probably we'll see some pressure on prices, but we're actually looking at very modest kinds of decreases, maybe 5% on feeder cattle and maybe fed cattle for the end of the year. Most of that's really seasonal pressure, and some of it comes from the fact that a year ago we're comparing to numbers that were stronger than expected. For 2019, on average, I would expect again some modest pressure. But obviously it depends on the demand side. Demand can stay strong enough to offset that supply pressure, so we kind of have to wait and see.
And on another note, you just took a trip to China where you taught an agribusiness course. Tell me a little bit about your China experience.
Well, I did teach a course at China Ag University. At Oklahoma State University, we have a joint agribusiness program with them. But after I finished that course in Beijing, then I was able to travel for about another 2 weeks. And I made a lengthy trip around central China, got to see a lot of country. I met with a number of individuals, particularly related to the cattle and beef industry, and learned a little bit about that. So, you know, we're trying to get a handle on sort of what the situation is in terms of beef and cattle markets in China, what the potential is in that domestic market, and ultimately then, of course, what potential there is for U.S. beef in that market.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Last week, Illinois Extension weed science specialist Dr. Aaron Hager explained his research on the management of herbicide-resistant pigweeds and how producers should act fast when Palmer amaranth is identified in their fields. However, due to similar characteristics between Palmer amaranth and common waterhemp, identifying these weeds can be difficult for some producers. While attending the Weed Management and Cover Crops Field Day held at the UNL South Central Ag Lab, we met with Nebraska Extension Weed Management Specialist Amit Jhala to learn how to identify these two pigweed species based on their leaf shape, leaf petioles, and plant structure.
So major weeds in this field or in this area are common waterhemp, Palmer amaranth. They both are pigweed species, as well as we have velvet leaf, common lame squatters, and some other grass species like foxtail species and barnyard grass and woolly cup grass. They are very commonly found grasses in south central Nebraska.
Among all of these weeds found in south central Nebraska, Palmer amaranth and waterhemp can be hard to distinguish amongst each other. However, according to Amit Jhala, there are 3 characteristics that can help producers identify each weed accordingly.
Because common waterhemp and Palmer amaranth, they both belong to the same family, pigweed family, also known as Amaranthus family. So sometimes it is hard to distinguish between them, but it is very easy if you follow the 3-step process. So I'm going to demonstrate how best and how easily you can differentiate common waterhemp with Palmer amaranth. So I have common waterhemp in my right hand and Palmer amaranth in my left hand, and I'm going to give you some 3 basic differences between them that will be very easy to understand and very easy to distinguish between those 2 species. For example, the shape of leaf is very important, and it will be number 1 character to differentiate common waterhemp with Palmer amaranth. On my right hand, I have a Palmer amaranth leaf, and on my left hand, I have common waterhemp leaf. If you will see the shape of Palmer amaranth, it's more like an egg shape compared with this common waterhemp leaf, which is more like a spoon shape. So those 2 characters can easily distinguish between these 2. For example, this Palmer amaranth is very broad from the middle, and the leaf is relatively short. Compared with common waterhemp, the leaf is relatively long and narrow. So this is number 1 character. The second character is length of the petiole. The petiole is the part that is basically connecting leaf with the main stem. For example, if I have a Palmer amaranth plant, so this is petiole, which is basically connecting leaf with main stem. And so I cut this leaf with petiole. This is Palmer Amaranth. And if you will bend, even with bare eye, you can see the length of petiole is really long. And if you will bend this, the length of petiole is longer than the actual size of leaf in case of Palmer Amaranth. In case of common water hemp, the length of petiole is relatively small if you compare with Palmer Amaranth. And if you will bend the petiole, you will see the petiole will be hardly half or longer than half, but it will not be longer than the length of the leaf in case of common water hemp. So now there are two characters. Number one, shape of leaf, egg shape, spoon shape. Second is length of petiole. And the third one, and which is also very important and easy to identify, is this Palmer Amaranth, which has more like a rosette-like structure. If you will see from the top of the Palmer Amaranth, you will almost able to see each and every leaf on the plant. And that's why, because they are taking advantage of long petiole, so they can trap all the solar energy and it can convert into the biomass energy. So that's why Palmer Amaranth, in my opinion, because of its rosette-like structure, it is more aggressive weed and it has more growth rate compared with any other pigweed species. And if you see water hemp leaves are more like alternate. You will not see, it will not set like a rosette-like structure as you see in case of Palmer Amaranth. So these are the basic three characters that can easily differentiate these two species of pigweeds.
It is important to remember how to distinguish between these two weeds, because when it comes to management, you will want to use the most effective herbicide.
Yeah, some herbicides, they work better on common water hemp, and some herbicides, they work better on Palmer Amaranth. So it is important to know in your field whether your field has majority of Palmer Amaranth or majority of them are water hemp. And sometimes if they both are existing, then you may also need to pick the herbicide that can provide effective control of both of the species.
You can learn more about Palmer Amaranth and common water hemp by reading Amit's Crop Watch articles at cropwatch.unl.edu. According to Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher, it is important to understand what an El Nino and a La Nina weather pattern means when it comes to agriculture. During an El Nino and a La Nina, there is a change of pressure patterns along the equatorial Pacific region. Due to the El Nino's weaker pressure patterns, the air currents are unable to pull the surface of the ocean in a westward fashion, causing a pooling of warmer than normal water in the central equatorial Pacific. During a La Nina, however, the pressure patterns are stronger and cause more upwelling cold water at the surface that is then moved westward along the equatorial Pacific. We recently met with Al to learn more about these weather patterns, but began by asking him why the Climate Prediction Center recently sent out an El Nino Watch.
We look at the equatorial region for a signature showing either above normal or below normal temperatures, and we look underneath the equatorial Pacific to see what the movement of water that's going to feed into that system. At present, we have an established warm pocket in the equatorial Pacific, and underneath of the equatorial Pacific, essentially from Australia all the way over to South America, we have a significant pool of warm water. So that's the feeder or conveyor belt for this system. That means that it's going to keep energizing that area with these above normal temperatures. Hence, we have an El Nino watch that's been put out by the Climate Prediction Center.
So how often does the El Nino occur, and when is it most generally the most significant?
Okay. Most of the events will come on an average return of 1 in 3 to 1 in 5 years, and about 1 out of every 3 events, not quite 1 out of every 2, but somewhere between 1 out of every 2 to 1 out of every 3 is what we call a multi-year event, meaning that it will last more than 1 season. Generally, we look in the late summer for the event to start materializing, strengthening as it goes into the fall, reaching a peak strength generally between Christmas and about the 3rd week of January. They can die earlier, they can last later, but that's what the mean is of all of the different events. And then we start to see a slow waning of that event as we go into the spring. Now, if we still maintain levels that are within the threshold of being either an El Nino or La Nina as we go into that April and May period, that's when we begin to watch to see whether or not this is a multi-year event. And generally under a multi-year event, the same patterns that are established in year 1 of the event tend to intensify in year 2. So if you're in a wet pattern, you get wetter. If you're in a dry pattern, you get drier.
So what are some of the typical responses that occur across the Southern Hemisphere?
Right. Since this event typically peaks out during the Southern Hemisphere's summer growing season, or our winter period, that's where we see the greatest agricultural impacts. And during El Nino events, typically we see on an average response coming out of Australia below normal wheat yields, out of Brazil normal to below normal soybean, below normal corn yields out of South Africa, but above normal corn yields coming out of Argentina. During La Nina events, we see the polar opposite: above normal wheat in Australia, above normal corn in South Africa, above normal soybeans in Brazil, but below normal corn in Argentina. So some of the problems we had last year in Argentina, we were going through a La Nina event, and we've seen some significant repercussions in terms of that yield. And that's important this year. We had a lot of debate of whether the tariffs that are in place. So this is another thing that producers should be looking to the Southern Hemisphere to see if they have some production hiccups, particularly as this event unfolds. Now, this event is not expected to be a strong event, and sometimes these weak and moderate events do not have nearly the signature that we see during the stronger events. So when we say 70%, it's not a guarantee. There's that 30% that basically doesn't fall in line, and those tend to be under the weaker events. So we have to keep that in the back of our mind. It's not a guarantee, but it gives us a direction of where the climate conditions in the Southern Hemisphere may play out as we go through this next 6 months to 9 month period.
So what about North America then?
Okay, in North America, typically we see the southern jet stream become the more dominant feature at the expense of the northern jet stream. And so we see the northern jet stream displace a little bit farther than its mean winter position, and the southern jet stream becomes strong. So as that becomes stronger, there's an area caught between the two jet streams that's kind of caught in no man's land. We call this a split flow pattern. Systems move to the north or to the south of the area caught in between these two jets. Typically that occurs in the northern to central plains, and including the northern Rockies. So we've started to see the monsoon kick up. The warm waters off of Mexico have led to the generation of tropical systems earlier than expected. We expected an above normal season, and a couple of those have already moved up the Baja Peninsula. We typically see that late in the season. So everything that we're seeing is pointing toward an increased flux of moisture into the southwest as we progress through the summer, into this fall period. That's probably our initial signs that the southern jet is kicking up. So from that point forward, what we looked for is, do we see the high pressure that's been dominating the southwest start to shift toward the north, push the northern jet stream to the north, and then to the east. And during most of these events, we carve out a small trough over the Great Lakes and the Pacific, or excuse me, the northeastern United States, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, kind of caught between those two flow patterns. So we tend to have more benign winter. Now, caution on that is because of the weak event, that northern jet may not be as weak as we would normally anticipate. And so really it's going to boil down to our fall and winter period, where that jet sets up the northern jet. If it stays in the position it has been for the last 6 weeks, then we're going to have a lot rougher time here in north central Nebraska and points to the north with all the heavy precip that would continue on through the fall period. But if that shifts like it normally does toward the Great Lakes, then we see a drying pattern establish out, particularly over the northern plains this fall and in through the spring period. Whereas the southern plains, including southern Nebraska, kind of gets taken the other way. Polar opposite what we've been seeing the last few weeks or months, and that is we see a wetter pattern establishing itself in the central and southern plains. So the wheat complex usually is the biggest beneficiary of these above normal precipitation patterns during El Nino, and of course coming off of a very strong drought, this would also spell good things possibly occurring for the southern Rockies. At the same token, the southern Rockies during El Nino events generally favors above normal snowfall. Then we see below normal snowfall developing in the northern Rockies, which we start to look in the spring period to see whether or not that would help to establish more drought signature in that region as we get into the warm season precipitation events.
Next week, Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Lauren Giesler will join us to talk about soybean diseases. Last year, the Nebraska Department of Ag received 90 claims of dicamba injury, and Extension educators compiled 348 claims representing roughly 50,000 acres injured. While there have been reports of injury this year, Nebraska Extension weed specialist Greg Kruger reminds producers that the yield impact from dicamba varies by location and the rate applied. Greg also says that producers should be patient while evaluating dicamba injury. You can read more about Kruger's research on dicamba injury in the July Nebraska Farmer. At the UNL South Central Ag Lab, there is an ongoing cover crop research that is using wheat stubble as a control in corn. The wheat stubble is mixed with either rye, oats, and/or both to create different cover crop mixtures. We met with Nebraska Extension agronomist Roger Elmore at the Weed Management and Cover Crops Field Day to learn more about this research and how the different cover crop mixes affect corn growth, development, and yield production.
So we're at South Central Ag Lab in South Central Nebraska. We have 640 acres here, mostly irrigated, but we do have a rain-fed or dryland piece, and that's what I'm standing beside here. And typically it's a wheat, our wheat nurseries are here. Dr. Steve Benzinger and his wheat nurseries are right over off to my right. There's several hundred, maybe 1,000 different wheat entries there of his advanced lines and varieties. And we had the question of what would happen if we tried to incorporate cover crops into that wheat system. So what we have is a wheat cover crop corn rotation or system here, where we're planting cover crops at 3 different times after the wheat is harvested in August and September, and the third date here was actually October this year. But what happens when you plant the rye, oats, or a combination of rye and oats? And then we also have a control, so 4 treatments, 6 replicates, and in the spring we terminate the cover crops. We measure biomass on the cover crops fall and spring, but we terminate those then and then plant corn in, this year it was May 2nd when we planted corn with a starter fertilizer here as well. So that was planted on May 2nd. We terminated the same day. We like to terminate a little earlier, but this year it was the same day. And then we're tracking what happens to the corn in terms of growth and development, as well as yield. We've done this now for 3 years.
After tracking what happens to the corn in terms of growth, development, and yield for 3 years, the cover crop mixes with wheat stubble had shown different results among the crop.
Right, so we're planting the corn in behind all 3 of those, the mix and the oats and the rye. But then we also have just the control, which is just wheat stubble itself. So we're looking at those, and what we can see behind us, you probably can in the frame here, but you can see a visual height difference. Behind rye, the corn is about this tall on me, and well, it's actually more like this. And behind just the wheat stubble. So the rye has reduced the growth and slowed down the development on the corn by 1 or 2 stages, and the height difference probably maybe 6 inches at this point. In the other 2 years, there have not been any yield differences at all. But we've always seen these kind of development and growth differences. So what happens between now and harvest is what dictates how the yields are going to pan out.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, most of the precipitation out to the end of the week was in western Nebraska, as we've seen a northwest flow with the upper air trough pivoting across the upper Midwest. That left a northwest to a southeast flow, and we did see scattered thunderstorm activity almost on a daily basis in western Nebraska into south central Nebraska, very little in eastern Nebraska, and we've been pretty much dry for the last 2 weeks. And that dryness now is starting to become a concern. After the big wet during June, we've seen many areas of eastern Nebraska start to fall apart in terms of precipitation, running anywhere from 30 to 50% of normal for the month, so we are starting to accumulate some deficits. Now, if we go to the current drought monitor, we will see some changes, and one of the changes I want to bring your attention is you'll see a little nose coming up into south central Nebraska with abnormally dry conditions. Now, this is an area that was first to come online with drought in Nebraska for this spring, and we did not see this as much moisture during the month of June as other areas of the state, and therefore we're starting to see things deteriorate rather rapidly. And I would expect, barring excessive precipitation over this next few hours, that this area will be upgraded to some extent to at least D1 conditions, with an expansion of abnormally dry conditions into parts of south central and southeast Nebraska. So as we look at the upper air model today, we do have that trough in place. This is a response for the precipitation that came through the western Nebraska last night and through this morning, and is now in its process of moving through the state. We have high pressure that will be building in as the day progresses, starting to dry things out during the later part of the day. But we see that we have this precipitation shield that will be sliding toward the south-southeast. Now, as we go into tomorrow, with that push with this front, we get much cooler air, and the trough basically stays in place. High pressure to our north, low pressure down over the Texas Panhandle. Does show that with that trough we will have some upslope flow, so some generation of precipitation along the Front Range, but high and dry everywhere else. By Monday, we start to see this trough trying to show some signs of moving toward the east. We still have high pressure to our north and to our west, and most of the precipitation associated with that trough will remain to our south. That trough really deepens to some extent as we get into Tuesday, bringing cool air straight from the north into our region, high pressure firmly controlled across the plains region. So most of the precipitation associated with this trough will be from the mid-Mississippi Valley region up to the lower Ohio River Valley region. And by the time we get to Wednesday, we start to see that trough breaking apart and lifting toward the northeast. The high pressure starts to build in, so we start to see the warmth returning to western Nebraska as surface lows take place up in Montana and southern Idaho. But the heavy precipitation will be associated with the trough as it moves closer to the eastern seaboard. And then as we get into Thursday, we start to get a zonal flow. Here's still the remembrance of that trough with surface low indicated for western South Dakota. Now, because that surface cold front on the eastern seaboard, that's going to interrupt the flow of moisture into our region, so this looks like to be a very dry low as it moves through. And as we get into the day on Friday, the main jet lays right across the Nebraska-South Dakota border, showing a surface low developing in the Texas Panhandle. That may start to move some moisture up into our region, and in combination with a cold front that will be coming through next weekend, that may generate some precipitation. Now, as this system passes toward the southeast, we get another influence briefly with cool high pressure, meaning next Thursday through the following Tuesday looks to be below normal, although there are signs that much warmer temperatures will build in, and then of course we have drier than normal conditions projected in the same period.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on cattle markets, identifying pigweed species, El Nino weather conditions, and cover crop research. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Heartland Farm Partners President Jeff Peterson will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Bridget Nelson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.